Continuing with visualization, analysis, and design, let's now talk about arranging tabular data. So in this segment, we're going to focus on tabular data as opposed to networks or spatial data, which we'll talk about in other sections. So big idea with tables is we want to think of them in terms of key and value attributes. So by key, I mean an independent attribute, to use the language of stats. To use the language of computer science, if you were looking up items in an array, we would think about how many unique indexes do you need. It needs to be unique so you can look it up. In a simple table, that's just one key. You can think about it as a spreadsheet. The rows are items, the attributes are columns, a cell contains a value. But when we have multiple keys, that is a multidimensional table, just like a multidimensional array in computer science, then we're going to have to think about using more than one key to look up some value. So multiple of these unique identifiers. The value we can think of in the language of stats as a dependent attribute. Now, what's interesting in visualization is we're going to classify things according to the sort of base bone of how many keys are used. So we're going to think about the case with 0 keys, where we're expressing values without any idea of a key, or 1 key where we've got some sort of list-oriented visual encoding, or 2 keys where we're thinking about having that more in a matrix form. We will talk about different numbers of keys even within the list form, but we'll think about the sort of spatial substrate that we're using. So let's start with scatter plots. This is a simple case. We're just expressing values. There are 0 keys. So what are we doing here? We have 2 quantitative attributes for our data. Our mark type is a point. And we're just using horizontal channel for both position and then, of course, order, and vertical for position and order. So what are we trying to do with these? People use them a lot. We might be looking for trends. We might be looking for outliers, like that one in the upper right corner for the left graph. We might be trying to look at distributions individually for the 2 different axes, although what they're even better for is showing the correlation between those 2 axes, or looking for cluster structure. For scalability, I'm going to be analyzing everything in terms of imagining that we have a display that's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, just to have some nice round numbers for thinking and talking about. So, and I'm going to talk about the limits of scalability, if we're getting aggressive and sort of pushing the limits. So for this one, let's think about, well, you could probably have 1,000 points before things really start being unreadable with too much occlusion and overplotting. So we'll think about 1,000 points as a reasonable limit on the number of items. Now, for the number of values that we could actually read off, that's also about 1,000 in each of those directions. We're able to see very, very fine distinctions between positions with these aligned axes. So 1,000 levels for the values, 1,000 items roughly. Now, we could keep going in terms of attributes. We can use more channels, right? Since we're using point marks, well, actually, for any marks, we could use color. With point marks, especially with these symmetric ones, we're thinking about using 2D size if you were just to make circles bigger. Now, when you have a single quantitative attribute that you're using to control a 2-dimensional area like this, keep in mind you don't just want to use the radius. You typically would want to take a square root because that area is going to grow quadratically, but the value that you're encoding is only going to go linearly. So you typically would want to tame that by taking a square root before encoding that. On the right, we see an example where we're symbol coding. So we've got these simple symbols that are trying to be quite perceptually different. Notice how we've got circles, but we also have pluses. We also have diamonds. In fact, they're actually redundantly coding with color, but you could have those be 2 separate categorical attributes. So coming back to the scatterplot tasks, just to make sure you know what's involved with correlation, if things are perfectly positively correlated, we have a diagonal going from down to up, down on the left to up on the right. And then as they get less and less correlated, that sort of spreads out until we have that no correlation case in the middle. And then as they're more and more negatively correlated, we see a diagonal pointing the other way, with a perfect diagonal being perfect negative correlation of exactly -1. For cluster structure, notice down here on the left side, we just have sort of an undifferentiated mass of point locations. We can't really see cluster structure. Whereas on the second one, we can absolutely see these three different clusters. And then on the third chart, what we see is a color coding where the color is completely correlated with that visible cluster structure. It's very common in data sets to have some, we'll call them classes here, but basically some categorical attribute, and you want to know if that's matching the cluster structure of the data. Notice how on the right we have an example where they don't perfectly match. They're a little bit matched up, but you can see that that color coding is not matching that geometric positioning. So it's a case where we don't have perfect correlation between that other categorical attribute and this cluster structure we're seeing in the data. We'll talk more about that particular use case much later when we get to aggregation. So what about this case where we've got some keys? Let's start out with the ones that are sort of built on the idea of a list. But first, let's talk about an idea of, hey, wait, if it's a categorical attribute, how can we encode anything spatially? Because after all, spatial position has an intrinsic ordering. And I talked a lot with Marks and Channels about how we didn't want to violate the expressiveness principle. And so how could we encode categorical data with any kind of spatial position? And the answer is we should think about breaking things up into categories where we separate into regions, and then we can order and align the regions with a different attribute. So let's look at that in more detail. If you want to separate into regions, we don't have to worry about whether that attribute is categorical or ordered, that is ordinal or quantitative. We could do that in any case. We could just say, for example, the number of different unique values, I'm going to split that up into regions. That is some sort of distinct areas. And then within each of those regions, I'm going to put a mark or I'm going to put a glyph. And what's good about this is we haven't yet said anything about ordering, so it's fine to do this with categorical attributes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take these regions and say, okay, now I'd like to order my region according to something. Well, and then I'll align it in the other direction, or rather, I could align it. I don't have to align it, but in many of the visual encodings we'll look at, they have aligned. So in these pictures, I'm ordering in one direction, which is horizontal, and I'm aligning vertically. In particular, what's happening with alignment is I am imposing a shared coordinate frame so that I can use absolute position to mean something. And that means I'm actually really emphasizing the difference between that attribute value and the 0 point, which is along the axis itself. And we'll see some examples of this. So here's a simple bar chart. And this is a case where we've got a data-driven ordering. So this is separated according to the categorical attribute, in this case of soccer team. And it's ordered according to actually the value of those soccer teams. And it's aligned where all of these segments are actually have their shared bottom, or actually left side, their shared left side. And then we can see these different lengths going to the right. So this is really the best case when it comes to visual perception. Of course, it's trivial to find out what's the top versus what's the bottom. So it's great for finding extreme values. And it's really clearly showing us a distribution, and it's allowing us to inspect that distribution wherever we're interested in. Now, in contrast, if we keep the separation and the alignment, but we don't keep the ordering, it's not as easy to read off certain things. We can still find Manchester United. It's pretty trivial to see that's the biggest. This is, I think, something like the number of games they won. But what if you had to look up the 4th highest one? What about the 7th highest one? That's not nearly as easy in this chart as opposed to the one on this previous page. Here's something even worse from a perceptual point of view. If we just have a circle packing where we have an area representing the number of games won by each of these teams, this is perceptually speaking much harder. We're using the channel of 2D size, that is area, which humans are less able to decode with high accuracy compared to that nice 1D position channel we saw before. Moreover, these aren't particularly ordered, so again, it's hard to find things. So this is less good from a purely perceptual accuracy point of view. Now, we'll talk over the course of this course about when you might choose to have something that maybe feels more expressive or engaging. But from a purely perceptual accuracy point of view, this is not nearly as good. So with that under our belts, let's come to bar charts. And this one, I'm going to have a vertical example. You can, of course, do these horizontally as well, and then just flip all my words horizontal and vertical. So here we've got one key, one value. Um, the key is a categorical attribute. The value is a quantitative attribute. And we're going to think of these as being segment marks. Now, you could think of these as being length-coded point marks if you don't really want to emphasize the fact that they're aligned to an axis. But by talking about them as segments, we're really emphasizing that alignment uh, even more. So for channels, we are separating by animal type into some regions. We've got one mark, one bar per region. And then we're ordering horizontally by an attribute of our choice. Now, the trivial one is just take the name of the attribute and take the characters of that name and use alphabetical order. So, and I am distinguishing between the name of the attribute and the attribute itself, right? So animal type as opposed to, CAT or WOAMBAT, which is the name of the animal where we have it in alphabetical order. So these animals are categorical. They're not intrinsically ordered, but their names can be. So that's this distinction that's actually a little bit subtle, but is important to understand. What's nice about alphabetical ordering by name is it's incredibly easy to look things up. If you know what you're looking for, you can find it in that list. But if we use a different ordering where we use the same attribute that we use for the vertical size coding to actually order them, well, then it's really easy to see distributions, much easier to understand the distribution, or, for example, to find extreme values. So horizontally, what we've done is we've positioned according to that order that we picked, and then we're just distributing along the axis at equal intervals. So the horizontal position is arising from our choice of horizontal ordering. Um, so in a lot of these kinds of charts, we sort of, instead of focusing on, oh, we have a position and then that means necessarily we have an order, we're sort of flipping that and we're saying, oh, we make a choice about the order and that leads to the position coding. Either way, both position and order are in use and actually encoding an attribute here. Well, what are we doing vertically? We're simply expressing that quantitative value. We're using vertical position and also order. And redundantly, we've got vertical size coding. And we're emphasizing the idea that we're thinking about the difference between the value and the 0 point on the axis below by considering it as a segment mark type. So for tasks, well, we can really easily compare those heights. That's what bar charts are fantastic for. We can look up values. We can also do some things like find distributions easily in the case where they're ordered, although not necessarily without ordering them. Now, coming back to our scalability analysis, well, how many bars could we have? That is, how many unique levels of the key attribute could we support? Clearly, dozens is easy, maybe even hundreds. Again, we're thinking about having 1,000 pixels on a side. So let's say up to hundreds of bars. And what about the lengths of those bars, the levels of that value attribute? Well, we could have literally up to 1,000. If we have 1,000 pixels, humans are really good at discriminating even quite fine differences between those lengths. So we're going to consider the number of length values that we could support as up to 1,000. Okay, so let's go from a normal bar chart to a stacked bar chart. What have we changed? So we're adding another key. So now we have two categorical attributes. So to look things up, in this case, we've got some plant species and some conditions under which they're grown. And so in order to find a particular value, we're using both of those to look something up, the species and condition as a tuple, a pair. Now, with this kind of a visual encoding, we do want to do that multi-level analysis where there's two different levels, because this isn't just a single mark, it's a glyph. Each of these bars is a composite object where the internal structure comes from multiple marks. So we can think about the whole glyph as a thing, then it's just a bar chart where we've got species, but we can also think within the glyph as these series of stacked components, these color-coded boxes. So coming back to our channel-based analysis, if we just think at the whole glyph level, it's just like we talked about with the normal bar chart. What about within the glyph? Well, we're separating according to position, and we're color coding by that condition. And then the vertical order is just, if we look at the legend, we see it's alphabetical by the condition name. Um, Now, size means something. The size of each of those segments is meaningful. And notice how they do have a shared boundary, right? Where the red one stops, the blue begins. Where the blue stops, the green begins. These are touching, they are shared boundaries. Vertical position is unavailable for everything except that bottom red mark. For the red mark, the top of it does mean something, absolutely, but not so for the blues or for the greens because their locations depends on where the red mark ended. So only the lowest component has vertical position used. It's unavailable for all the rest. And we're thinking about these marks as segments or length-coded point marks if we want to think about them that way. Now, what we've added in terms of our task is everything we could do with the bar chart, but also this idea of a part to whole relationship, by which I mean, and typically we think about part to whole relationships when we have a relatively small number of levels. Here we've got 3, and we want to know, well, what's the ratio between these 3 different parts? And that's exactly what we can read off from a stacked bar chart. What's interesting here is the asymmetry of the scalability. For the stacked attribute, the one that we have colored boxes for, we can't have hundreds. That would be crazy. That would be unreadable. So up to maybe 10 or 12 levels, around a dozen, is reasonable for these stacked components. Whereas for the number of bars, it's just like before. We could still have dozens or maybe hundreds. So there's a real asymmetry in those 2 key attributes. They're both keys, but they are not at all equal in terms of what numbers this chart can support. Now here's one. This visualization, visual encoding is called a stream graph. And what it is it's sort of a generalization of stacked bars where what you really want to emphasize is the continuity of some stacked attribute over time. Typically, these do have the horizontal axis as time. So rather than being focused on a lookup of at a discrete time point, you want to look up a particular attribute. Instead, we're doing something a little different. So we're going to take our data. We've got 2 keys. In this case, in this example, the one attribute is movies. The other attribute is time. Um, and then we have counts, like how many people saw the movie in that day or month or year. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to derive something. And we're not just going to derive something simple, like a single number. We're going to derive an entire poly. We're going to derive a blob, a shape, where we've explicitly using an algorithm to construct this shape so that the height at each spot in time does encode the number, those counts, the number of times that movie was seen at that time. Now, like a stacked bar, vertical position is not available because we don't read off absolute numbers here. And even the order of what order we put these movie layers in is also algorithmically determined. So we can think of that as a derived attribute. Now, the horizontal position, you can read off the time from that, but the size isn't particularly available. Now, let's look at a real-world example of how this has been used. What's really interesting about this is the scalability. Just like a stacked bar chart, right? We could have hundreds of time values. But unlike the stacked bar chart, we can have a lot more movies, right? With the stacked bar, we've already said, oh, you couldn't have hundreds. But with this, you can. And why? Because most of these movie layers do not extend across the whole chart. So there's a way in which they're sort of sharing that space. And this is what and again, these are algorithmically determined here. The paper on top is a reference to, a bunch of different ways of actually designing that algorithm. So the key thing is we're not giving labels to all of these movie layers in the static version. We've got a few large ones where they're labeled, but the small ones aren't labeled. Typically, this is used interactively where you can mouse over and then actually see what the other ones are. So this is a nice example of interactivity as being fairly crucial to get what you would really want to get out of these. And yet, these are interesting enough statically that, for example, they have been printed in newspapers. So it's a mixture of a static and interactive visual encoding. So now let's get to the line chart. There's a way in which this is like a bar chart in that you've got one key and one value. Um, so what's a little different is we think about both of these as being quantitative. So you can have quantitative keys. For example, years are a great example. Um, so they definitely have an order. We could even do arithmetic on them in a way that's interesting. But we are assuming in our data set that we only have one value for each unique version of that key. Now, what are we doing with marks? I drew a bunch of point marks here, but that's not actually necessarily going to be drawn in a line chart. What we're doing is we've got a path mark. We are connecting up the values at each of these keys, and we've got a connecting mark that does this. It could be piecewise linear. It could actually be smoothed with some sort of spline. If we wanted to, we could include those point marks at the exact locations where we know these values. That's certainly possible, but it's not required. So what we're doing from a channel point of view is we're expressing these quantitative values with both horizontal and position and vertical position and order, in some ways almost like a scatter plot, but then we are drawing this connecting mark. And with this connecting mark, what's notable is we could use line width, right? We could have a line width. We don't have to, but it is available. Um, just for the purposes of sort of having a compact, controlled vocabulary, when we're talking about these path marks or these segment marks, I'm going to consider the long way, the direction along the line, as horizontal, and then the other way as vertical, just so we have a way of talking about that. Um, Now, notice how the horizontal size, that is, going from 2004 to 2005, that's not available to encode something else. It's just showing you the interval. That length is the interval between these expressed values. In many cases, it's uniform, although sometimes you'll see line charts where there's a non-uniform sampling of those points. So what do we use this for? Well, it's really all about trends. It's about noticing the shape of that curve, of that path. To decompose this, to analyze this, the connection marks are emphasizing the ordering of the items along the key axis by explicitly indicating the relationship between one item and the next. So it's a sort of interesting property of those. From a scalability point of view, well, we could definitely have, 1,000 levels across if we needed to. We could have 1,000 levels up and down, because remember, we've got our 1,000 by 1,000 pixel display that we're thinking about. So we were using this very fine-grained aligned position channel, so we're able to use really the maximum there. So when should we use which one? It depends on what your key attribute is. If it's categorical, use a bar chart. If it's an ordered attribute, use a line chart. Don't get those backwards because people will make crazy conclusions. There's this expressiveness principle we keep talking about, and we don't want to violate that. By connecting things up, we have a strong implication that one leads to the other. So they literally have done studies. Zaks and Tversky did a great study in the late 90s where people would say things like, they'd say, well, the more male a person is, the taller he is when they were shown things like this chart. As you go from female to male, you get taller. As opposed to, on average, men are taller than women. That's a reasonable thing to do. On average, 12-year-olds are taller than 10-year-olds. That's reasonable. As you go from 10 to 12, that makes more sense, but you don't go from female to male. That's categorical, not ordered. So be aware that chart types really can mislead. One reason we're going a lot into the theory in this class is to sort of talk about what are the affordances, what are the ways that charts push your perceptual system to think about something, and it can be so strong it actually overrides what you know cognitively. So label your axes. It is absolutely the best practice to label them. We'll talk more about small multiple views later where maybe they'll have shared labels, but in general, you want to label your axes. We can have snark from XKCD to show why we should all be fine, upstanding individuals that label our axes. We will be expecting you to do that in things like your final projects. What about some other best practices? Well, be careful about cropping the y-axis. In general, you want to show the 0 point. you're making judgments with respect to the 0 point. And you can have some very deceptive charts if your bottom is not at 0. With a gloriously titled paper, Truncating the Y-Axis Threat or Menace by Carell et al., they've got some nice examples. Now, it's also worth thinking this is not absolutely global advice. There are exceptions. Sometimes the euro is an arbitrary place, and then you actually want to be able to change that, like with index charts. Sometimes small changes really do matter, like with the average global temperature by year. So there's nuances. You have to think about what you're trying to achieve. But in general, think very carefully before cropping a y-axis. People have also done perceptual studies about, like, even if you really bring their attention to the fact that you cropped it with big arrows and big, ways of trying to remind them you've done that. Again, the perceptual system can really just sort of override cognition. So all the warnings in the world end up not actually solving this problem. So I mentioned an index line chart. What is that exactly? Well, it's a situation where we still have two quantitative attributes, keys and values, but we're going to make a new derived attribute where we have this idea of we're indexing against a particular, it could be against a time or a currency or something like that. So we're going to plot this indexed thing rather than the original value. So typically we're showing change over time with this. Um, and what we're really focused on is not absolute numbers anymore of our raw data, but this normalized number of the derived data. So from a scalability point of view, it's absolutely the same as a standard line chart. I'm just pointing out that sometimes what you do with the data by transforming it, that is the data abstraction, can affect the way you see the meaning in that, even if the visual encoding is essentially the same here. How about Gantt charts? Um, Now, here's one where we actually still have just one key, but we have these two different values, but they are related. So think of it as a categorical attribute, but two quantitative attributes. And we're using a segment mark. And this really is a segment where the way we're thinking of it is that horizontally, in this case, of course, they could go the other way, but typically they are going horizontally, where we have time as the horizontal axis. So we've got a start time and an end time for a particular, in this case, task. Um, and so you can either think of encoding the start and the end, and then what you get is the duration as a start minus end value. Or you could think if you just had start time and duration, then that would sort of give you end time. So either way, you can think of this as essentially two numbers that are getting encoded. Um, Now, along the vertical axis here, we're just separating according to tasks. In this case, we're ordering by the name of the task, which is hopefully actually meaningful. You could imagine that you would use Gantt charts. In fact, you do use Gantt charts to think about, do you have the ordering right? Is this a good order in which to do these? Because are there dependencies between when one might have to end and one might have to start? They're used for project planning. So the position is according to task. Um, so again, what they are used for is to really notice things like overlaps and think and reason about the start and end dependencies between items. From a scalability analysis point of view, we can probably have dozens of bars because we do actually need these to be typically long enough that we can get some sense of reading off those durations. And, the number of levels we could have across horizontally, well, it's about 1,000 with our 1,000 pixels. So we can go all the way down to a 1 pixel level with the times or the durations. Here's another one, slope graphs. Sometimes these are called bump charts. Um, so what we're doing here is we've got two values that we're expressing. So wait, don't have any keys all of a sudden. What we're doing is we are taking those two values and now we are creating a mark, a segment mark where we connect those two values. So we lay out values, you think conceptually, you don't have to draw points. You think of the value on one axis, the value on another axis, and then you connect them up with a line. Um, so what we've done is we have two different axes. We've got a one per attribute, and then we can actually width code that. Here we've got a derived attribute, which is the amount of change. And that's what we're using to width code those lines. And the length is unavailable, right? The idiom has decided all these lengths are the same. Um, I mean, technically, there's a correlation with the length of the line and its slope, but we're not really focused on that. We're just thinking the idiom has decided where these are. They're connecting marks, and the main point of them is that they're connecting up these two values. And then, of course, here we're all also color coding, although that's not required. So, unsurprisingly, the task is to emphasize changes in the rank or the value. For scalability, we could have 1,000 different value levels up and down, and let's say dozens of items. It starts getting very, very cluttered if you would go to, hundreds of these lines. All right, let's move on to two keys. So now we're in a situation where we aren't thinking things are just so much lists. We're really thinking of a matrix, of a grid. And the classic example of that is a heat map. Sometimes these are called tiled heat maps. Um, So the data is two categorical attributes. In this case, they're very commonly used in biology. So we'll think a gene along one way and the experimental condition along the other way. And then the attribute, a quantitative attribute, will be kind of how much of a protein was expressed by this gene, what's called the expression level. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Now, we're going to think of these as point marks where we've separated into regions and then we're ordering and aligning both ways. So both vertical and horizontal have got a position that means something. It's like the index you use to look that up. So they have shared boundaries. The left of one is the right of the other. The top of one is the bottom of the other. What that means, because there's shared boundaries, is that size is unavailable. We're using its space filling. We're completely using up space with these color codings. So orientation isn't available because we've got these shared boundaries. And not only are 1D and size in both directions unavailable, but 2D size is also, unsurprisingly, unavailable. So we've got this ability to look up. Now, the color channel is actually being used to color that entire block by that quantitative attribute. We'll talk more about color later. Technically, it's an ordered diverging color map. Now, you can definitely use this to find outliers. You can find the really bright green and bright red boxes here. If the order is done right, and we'll get to that in a second, then you could find clusters. What I want you to notice here with the scalability analysis is the asymmetry here. So let's say you could get hundreds of categorical levels. Again, if we had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, you could have hundreds of boxes in each direction. That gets you up to almost 1,000,000 items. But you cannot see hundreds of different levels of red or of green. On a good day, maybe you can see 5 levels of each, and actually maybe more with this projector of like 3 or so levels. So black, a little bit of green, more green, super bright green. Black, a little bit of red, even more red, highly saturated red. So let's say you could say 5 levels of each, that's 10 in total. So that's a huge asymmetry between the number of levels of the quantitative attribute, which is only 10, as opposed to showing hundreds of these items. So that asymmetry, again, is notable. Now, I mentioned ordering. Well, if we just order things in the heat map according to the name of the attribute, we usually just sort of see noise, right? We don't, here's where we've got a cars data set, we're just ordering alphabetically, and it's really hard to see structure. On the right, we're ordering by a derived attribute where there's a lot of algorithms for trying to do this matrix reordering or serialization. There's different names for this from different algorithmic communities, but there's algorithms that really do try to derive a data-driven way of ordering these to maximally show you these clusters visibly. So, for example, another visualization idiom is where you actually run, for example, clustering algorithms to try to do that reordering and actually show people. So in addition to this heat map, we're actually showing two trees, one on each side. Technically, it's a form of tree called a dendrogram. And so you're connecting up the children to the parent. We'll talk more about trees in another session. But what I want you to notice about these trees is all the leaves are aligned. So the leaf positions are aligned, which means you can start to read off how many levels up you are from the leaf level. And that's really what those dendrograms are trying to express. And they're showing you the way in which there are, um, you should interpret these clusters in the heat map according to these families that you're seeing in the cluster dendrograms. So from our analysis point of view, we're using the traversal of the cluster hierarchy to come up with these orderings and positions for the vertical and the horizontal axes. Typically, the reason you would do this is there's a lot of different algorithms for clustering. It's well known that none of them is perfect. Every one of them gives you slightly different results. So typically, you've got some sort of expertise in the data. You're trying to assess the quality of these different possible clusterings found by automatic methods. So sometimes you really are trying to say, what are the clusters, or do I believe these clusters? Do these align with anything I already know about the data set? Okay. Now let us continue on with tables, but we're going to continue talking about them. So this is part 2 of revised tables. What I want to focus on in this one are the orientations of these axes. So we've been talking a lot about rectilinear or Cartesian axes so far. Let's also think a bit about radial or polar axes. So let's start with a sort of simple case, a star plot or a radial bar chart. So this one on the left, a star plot, is where you've got segments and they're meeting at some central radial point. Or a radial bar chart is where you also have things laid out radially, but there's sort of a central ring. And these axes are going to the ring rather than collapsing to that point. Now, both of these are basically a bar chart where you are ordering things radially rather than rectilinearly. So in particular, with our mark and channel analysis, we've got radial position, that is the distance from an origin point for a quantitative attribute. And then we've got something typically a categorical attribute where we're using angular position. So we're going around, and that angular position is encoding that other attribute. That's basically the analog of a bar chart, where instead of doing that horizontally and vertically, we're doing that with radial length and with angular position. So why does this matter? From a mathematical point of view, these are kind of equivalent, but from a perceptual point of view, they're absolutely not equivalent. We've talked a lot about the high precision aligned position. That works for rectilinear positions. So that works for things that are horizontal and vertical. As we are animals that evolved in a state of gravity, horizontal and vertical mean really different things. So they don't apply to radial layouts. So even though they're mathematically equivalent, they're not perceptually equivalent. Our ability to do things like just judge lengths that are pointing any which way, we could think of them as being, radially on a radial axis, but our visual system can't do that in the same way. So we're really stuck with just making length judgments. We're not able to decode things at that same level of accuracy that we could with the radial compared to the rectilinear. Here's another one where it's sort of, sometimes these are called radar charts or spider charts. They're a lot like line charts, but they're radial in the sense that, well, you've got all these item values and you're connecting them up with a mark, so a path. But there's a really important difference. Unlike a rectilinear bar chart, that path is closed. So suddenly it's a poly. It's actually a 2D shape. That's the boundary of a 2D shape rather than just a line with free-floating endpoints. So that is from a perceptual point of view, it's quite a different state of affairs with these radar charts than with a line chart. Now you can fill in the interior. You don't have to, but as we see on the right, we've got the interior fill, and that makes that shape even more salient. And you could explicitly plot the point marks just like you could for a rectilinear line chart, but again, you don't have to. If you did, those would be at the same level. Sometimes these are called other things, Kvyat diagrams, polar charts. But in general, the thing is, if your data is cyclic, it can often make a lot of sense to do it this way. But if your data isn't cyclic, you start getting a really strong sense of pattern for things that are maybe not going to make so much sense. In particular, how did we decide on the order of these axes? Here we have English and math next to each other. We would see a really different shape if those axes were laid out in a different order. So that really salient shape is encouraging you to think of it as an area as opposed to just decoding the values as you might if it were a rectilinear bar chart or a line chart. So if your data is cyclic, these can make a lot of sense. If it's not, you might want to seriously consider whether you're doing the right thing. Here's a nice example of a redesign from Alberto Cairo, where his advice is avoid them 99.9% of the time. And he did a nice redesign of a newspaper graphic where he argued that this radar graph was quite hard to interpret. And when he unwrapped this, um, maybe it's considerably easier to think about these vote patterns. So think carefully about radial versus rectilinear. Now, the best known radial chart type is clearly the pie chart. So what is going on with pie charts? Well, like a bar chart, we can think of having a categorical key attribute and a quantitative value attribute. Now, with a pie chart, what you're doing is you're varying the angular position, but you fix the radial distance, right? It's a circle all the way around. They're the same. The end of that wedge is the same distance from the radius for all of them. So we're going to think of these as polymarks, even though they represent only a single item, but as we'll see, they have sort of complex shape and structure. So we've got angular, in this case, we're looking at a diamond data set, so it's the clarity of a diamond. And the angular, both the position and the order, and the size. We can think of size as being something that we can do radially, just like we could do size rectilinearly. So that angular position is what's getting encoded, and there's a shared boundary, right? All these wedges touch each other. That's a shared boundary. Now, radial position, as I said, is uniform and it's unavailable, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a pie chart. It would be something else. Now, the 2D size is also unavailable because we already used up the size ability to encode with that angular position. But I'll note that it does vary linearly with that angular size. That's important, as we'll see. So we're in the same boat as we were before, which is that angular position is less accurately able to be read than the rectilinear aligned position. So we will have less accuracy. And this is the task, just like with the stacked bar chart, but even more so, of part to whole judgments. What's the ratio of these different levels of this single categorical attribute? How many? Now, you might think of the pie chart as the alternative to a bar chart that's radial, but actually it's not. There's something that's much more analogous to a radial bar chart, which is what's sometimes called the coxcomb chart. And that's where you're varying the radial distance and then uniformly distributing things around from an angular point of view. So it's sort of the inverse of a pie chart. Again, we have a complex mark, so we're going to call it a poly because its exact shape actually matters. And so there are uniform widths, right? Each of these wedges is the same angular width, and that is why it is unavailable. They have shared boundaries, so that part is just like the pie chart in that the boundary is shared from an angular position point of view. Now, the radial position and order, and also redundantly the size, is that clarity attribute. So we're actually, those lengths mean something, and they're radial lengths along these radial spikes. For the same reason as we saw before, 2D area is unavailable because we're using a 1D size coding. Now, sometimes this is called the Nightingale plot or the Nightingale rose or the polar area chart. It was actually literally proposed by Florence Nightingale. And this was this historic document where she was arguing that a lot more people were dying from disease than from wounds or anything else in a particular military context. So she had a rhetorical point she was making. These outside ones that are blue, the point she wanted to make was these are big numbers. Now, let's think about, was this a completely fair way to graph that data? What's really tricky about a coxcomb plot is that the width of these sectors is increasing in a non-uniform way with the length. As you get further and further out from the radius, that width increases. So it is not linear, whereas with the bar charts, it is linear, right? The width of the bar doesn't matter, no matter how high the bar is rectilinearly, but it really affects the area in these radial diagrams. So we have this tricky situation where, as visualization designers, what we have actually encoded, which is a 1D size, a 1D angular size, is a length. But what people are decoding, what they're tending to look at, this area is not linear with what you encoded. So that 2D size, that area, is not linear with the 1D size of the length of that wedge. This is why bar charts are safer because of that uniform width. And that's not about whether it's rectilinear or radial, because that's possible to do in both cases. So the coxcomb chart does have the possibility to be quite perceptually misleading and thus confuse people. Now, you could argue that for Florence Nightingale, she actively wanted people to sort of note that overemphasis on that. So, from an engagement and rhetorical and narrative point of view, perhaps she made a choice that was good for her purposes. But from the point of view of actually being able to decode that data accurately, it's not as clear as it could have been. But that brings up the question, what are people doing when they look at things? You know, we've been sort of able to assume that what we encoded and what they decode was sort of lined up for a lot of the charts we've talked about so far. But people have actually relatively recently done studies about, well, what's going on? Some cleverly designed studies from Robert Cassara et al. uh, actually tried to vary a few things to understand, well, what are people doing when they read off pie charts? And there's some evidence that they might actually be getting the arc length around the circumference of a circle. What he has pretty clear data showing is they're not actually reading the angles. Um, they might be reading the areas. That's still sort of a bit TBD. Um, but one of the nice things to come out of this was some pretty good empirical evidence that donut charts are certainly no worse than pie charts. Um, and so, from an analysis point of view, we're going to think of those as basically the same thing. It's just that there's this kind of cutout offset from the middle if it's a donut chart rather than a pie chart. So, all of the same considerations you should think about for pie charts are also something you should think about for donut charts. For example, final projects. So, when is it legitimate to use a pie chart? Well, if you only have two levels, they're actually very good for a part to whole task. So, it's quite legitimate when you've got just a few levels of quite different sizes, you can get a clear sense of part to whole. Um, but once you start getting more than just a few levels and the details matter, they are clearly worse than a bar chart. So this is a nice example of where you look at these pie charts and they really do look pretty similar. It's pretty hard to tell what's going on. You look at the bar charts and it's extremely clear that you've got this increasing trend for one, this sort of variable thing for the middle one, and then a decreasing trend for the one on the right. And you just can't see that in the pie chart. The other sin with pie charts is cramming way too many levels in. This is not a good visual encoding here because you just have too many levels. So a few levels, pie charts are very defensible, but then they get less and less defensible as the different, if you've got a lot of levels or you've got levels, even a relatively small number of levels where the values are pretty similar, pie charts are not as easy to decode. Now, there's another way to show part-to-whole relationships. Let's look at the normalized stack bar chart. So with that one, we also are thinking about the task of part-to-whole judgments. But we're going to take a stacked bar chart and then normalize it. That is, stretch the bars to go all the way up to the top. And then we've got these relative sizes to show proportions. So we've got an example here with the top is a stacked bar, and then we've got a normalized stacked bar right beneath it. So what's different? Well, for one thing, for that bar level, vertical position no longer means something, right? Vertical size is now uniform and thus it's unavailable because of the choice of the idiom. Now, what's interesting about this is, you know, in the stacked bar, you could read off the height of the whole bar and you could also read off from absolute position that very bottom component. Well, in a normalized stack bar, you can still read two numbers, but they're not the same ones. You can read off the bottom, or you can start at the top, and you can read off the top one. So what's interesting is you can still see two numbers, but not the same ones. Now, the other really interesting thing about normalized stacked bars is the information density is much greater. Notice how many pixels I need to show a pie chart with the same data compared to just a single bar with one of these normalized stacked bars. So up above, we're seeing information for all 50 states of the US. That would take a lot of space to show with 50 pie charts. Um, Whereas we can, and we even have some nice ability to sweep our eyes back and forth across all 50 of these because it's much, much more compact. So I've given you a lot of examples of why radial can be problematic, but what's it good for? Well, it is really, really good for cyclic patterns. For, in particular, um, here is two examples of radial of rectilinear charts on top and these so-called glyph maps, these radial charts on the bottom. This is actually a paper from Hadley Wickham, the same person who did things like ggplot and the tidyverse, for those of you who keep track of the R world. So for periodicity, it's really nice. Notice how to see what's linear versus nonlinear is completely obvious in the charts on the top, just trivially obvious. It's not so easy to see in the charts on the bottom. It's actually kind of subtle. You'd have to think about what it means. But notice how figuring out if that periodic pattern with those three lobes comes a little bit before, a little bit after, matching up almost completely. It's great for that radial chart in a way that's really hard to understand exactly what that might mean with the rectilinear chart above. So you can definitely make use of the fact that cyclic data you can really understand more by having that thing where the axes actually align, where the end and the beginning are the same thing, if that is a characteristic of the data set. What about this other type, parallel? Maybe that's a new idea. Let's see what that is. So let's go back to our scatter plot. What's commonly used in visualization is a scatter plot matrix, known as a SPLOM for short. And that's an example where we've taken a rectilinear plot and we've said, oh, we could just have lots of them. We could take let's say we've got 9 attributes. We could say, oh, I'm going to make every possible set of axis pairs. And in this case, we only need half of that triangular matrix. So how far could we go with this? Well, maybe up to about a dozen attributes. I mean, this is 9, and already those scatter plots are getting pretty small. So if we had a dozen attributes, right, we'd have 12 by 12. Maybe we can't fit so many points in any one of those individual scatter plots because there's going to be a lot of overplotting. So instead of hundreds of items in each, maybe we can see dozens of items in each. But we're really starting to hit the limits of overplotting and clutter. What could we do that's different? We could say, well, with orthogonal axes, right, we can only show 2 attributes. We can show vertical position and we can show horizontal position, and then we've run out of positions. We'll talk much later about how to think about 3D, but that's not going to save the day. Spoiler alert. What else could we do? We could have axes line up in parallel, where we could show n attributes with n axes by just saying, well, on each of them we could figure out a vertical position, and then we can use one of these connecting marks to just connect up all of these different points. So now we have one of these paths actually represents an item. It's a jagged line. It's piecewise linear for each one of those little subsegments. So in a Cartesian, in a rectilinear scatter plot, the item is a point. In parallel coordinates, the item is one of these jagged paths, sometimes called a polyline. What's interesting about this is, well, we can fit quite a lot of attributes this way, right? We could fit dozens. I mean, not hundreds, certainly not thousands, but dozens is a whole lot more than 2, which is all we could do with scatter plots. And in each of them, before we get too much clutter, we could probably fit hundreds of items. So what's interesting about this, and it might not be instantly obvious to you unless you start doing some analysis, is you can read off correlation from these parallel coordinate views. So just like with the scatterplot matrix, we have a diagonal for the positive and negative correlations, and then when it's no correlation, it's sort of in between, spread out. With parallel coordinates, we actually have an asymmetry. Positive correlation is completely parallel line segments, and perfect negative correlation, they cross at this halfway point. And then as the scatter gets more and more spread out, that's where they're uncorrelated. So with training, you can read correlation off of these parallel coordinate views. Now, the big limitation here is the most salient patterns are between neighboring pairs of axes. So with the adjacent axes, like here, cylinder to displacement, we can see structure. But if I want to reason about cylinder compared to mileage, ooh, that gets much, much harder. Those axes are quite distant, and there's a lot of things happening in between. So the big question here is, did you pick the right axis order to show the patterns? That's the hard part. Um, so it's certainly possible to give interactive exploration where you can start moving them all around, but you quickly get to this sort of n squared search problem. There are algorithms that have been proposed for this. None of them perfectly solve the problem, as with a lot of other situations. So a lot of techniques have something where there's an arbitrary choice. You can give interactivity to let people hunt around, but that can degenerate into human-powered search. We'll talk more about that when we get to interaction. Let me come back to that slope graph I talked about. That's just a special case of parallel coordinates where you only have two axes. So this is actually what we just saw. So they're not as unfamiliar to us as they could be, but parallel coordinates continues with that line of reasoning. So thinking about the limits of orientations, with rectilinear, the big limit is the number of axes. 2 is great. We'll talk later about why 3 is actually extremely tricky because of the human perceptual system again. 3D depth is not the same as these nice aligned positions in horizontal and vertical. And 4 or more is impossible. Of course, you can do interesting and fun things with mathematical visualization of four-dimensional objects. I even did that back in the day in the 90s. But it's not straightforward the way it is for a standard rectilinear coordinate system. Now, with parallel coordinates, it is unfamiliar to many people. It is possible to train, but that will take some time and energy. And then with radial coordinates, there are these real strong perceptual limits. In addition to these issues about the precision of where you can read off information, with angular position being just much lower precision than rectilinear position, and radial distance being lower precision because you're just doing a length judgment instead of an aligned judgment. There's this non-uniformity. The size, if you just have a grid in radial coordinates versus rectilinear coordinates, the size of the sectors is not uniform. Both their 1D size width and their area depends on the radial distance. So often this is a problem. However, sometimes you could say, no, 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 it's not a bug, it's a feature. You could actually exploit this property on purpose. If you are trying to visually encode two attributes where the importance is not the same, you might deliberately use this fact in your visual encoding. So like many things, there's not a wrong and a right answer in all cases, but you want to be aware of the properties and the characteristics so you can make it actually match up to your data. Of course, the strength of radial coordinates compared to rectilinear is, or parallel, is that cyclic nature of the representation. So when your data does have cyclic properties, it can be really good to be able to actually show that so that the end and the beginning wrap around and you're able to actually perceive that directly. One last thing to talk about this time is the idea of layout density, whether it's simply deliberately dense or full-on space filling. So space filling, for example, is those heat maps we saw. Those are absolutely filling space. Um, let's talk about a slightly less extreme version, but that's still quite aggressive about how much you can fit. Here's a system for showing software overviews in quite a dense way. The input data is just text, that is lines of code. So it's text that's got a particular structure. So for each line of code, you literally know what line that is. Now we also have a quantitative attribute associated with each line of code, which is results of doing a whole battery of unit tests on it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have derived data where we're going to have two quantitative attributes. The character position of in that line of code when you first start actually using it as opposed to white space, and what the maximum is. And this might seem kind of strange and non-informative, but what we're going to do is we're going to make a segment mark with those two derived attributes, And then we're going to color code it by the quantitative attribute of the test results. Now, this is another one of those two-level layouts. So let's just think about a single column, that single column on the left side there. What we're doing is, well, the vertical order is just the order of the code in the program, right? It's just that line of code order. And it is shared in that it's actually just a 1 pixel high line. So these are very, very aggressive in terms of information density. So it's shared, these lines are all touching, and the vertical size is not available. This is a uniform 1 pixel high thing. But then horizontally, we're actually able to show both that min and that max. Now, it's a bit subtle because these are so aggressively small, but I do want you to notice that this is not aligned horizontal position. We're actually just getting the extent. Some of those lines of code are indented from the others, so the position of the end of that is not actually, there's the size of the line, but that's not actually the maximum, it's not the same as the extent. Now, what you'll start to notice is we do see some patterns of where test results are, and we can look at quite large bodies of code because what we've done is we've laid things out kind of conceptually in one really long column, and then we're using a scanline wrapping to get multiple columns along. So we're able to fit like an order of magnitude more instead of a very long skinny thing. We're wrapping it to get more of a square, much like we saw in that water example of last time. So at level 2, the global level, we've got this scanline wrap. And so what that means is we're able to actually see something like over 10,000 lines of code. Of course, if you want to read the code, well, this is what we have interactivity for. You would click in a particular region, and then you would be able to actually see a very, very small region of code that shows the line you clicked on, what it actually would be. But in general, what you're doing with this kind of system is you're really trying to get an overview. We'll talk more about overviews in weeks to come, but suffice it to say that you want to get an overall sense of things where it's okay to have very aggressively aggregated things because it shows you where to look next. So more on that later. What we've done is we've now walked through a bunch of considerations when we're arranging tabular data. Are we expressing a quantitative value, or are we separating categorical attributes and then ordering them and aligning them according to something more ordered, ordinal or quantitative? We thought about layouts where we've got kind of a list-based visual encoding backbone or a full-on matrix or grid. And then we talk about these orientations of rectilinear versus radial versus parallel, and the idea of having possibly very dense layouts. So this was all one section of larger considerations. So we will be talking more about both how to encode data with other kinds of data types, namely networks and spatial data, and how to use some of the other channels like color, and then finally how to do more interactive things. But that is another video.